I on? I sound, yes, okay. All right. I hope everybody had a great lunch and plenty of good discussions. It is my pleasure to kick off our afternoon workshop portion with RunningHorse Livingston. RunningHorse Livingston is the founder and CEO of Mathematize Incorporated, whose mission is to promote education and educationally related opportunities for Native people. RunningHorse, a nationally recognized educator and consultant, has spent 14 years helping teachers across the country make sense of their roles in the age of Common Core standards and making schools more constructive places for children to learn and grow. He is an expert in mathematics instruction and school reform. A member of the Bad River Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, RunningHorse currently teaches education methodology courses for 2 teacher preparation cohorts and supports 5 school districts in their efforts to rehumanize the learning experience in their learning communities. RunningHorse's hundreds of hands-on workshops and conference presentations are known for being thoughtful, practical, and entertaining. He has spoken at dozens of prominent conferences in the United States, and he also informed me he was the starting guard for his freshman high school basketball team. Right, so please join me in welcoming RunningHorse Livingston.
Good morning. I meant good afternoon. That was a trick question. Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here in the land of the Ho-Chunk. I was grateful for the acknowledgement here at the college because that's not something you hear pretty regularly. I myself, as was mentioned, I'm half Ojibwe and half Ho-Chunk. I've given some serious thought to making my own tribe called the Ojibwe-Chunk, but that's still in the works. I love the name Icebreaker. I think that was Kristen's idea. Although when I first meet people, the whole name sharing thing and the origin, I tend to shy away from just because people, when you hear the name RunningHorse, that's at least a 30-minute conversation. So I'm glad I was in the back and not fully participating. So the other thing that was not mentioned about my background that you need to know is I am a Capricorn. I enjoy long walks on the beach and sunsets, just so we're all clear on that. And I will say this, we're here to talk about culture. I know that I don't like to use the word culture too much because there's a stigma that goes with that word. As a PK-12 educator, there's a certain idea when you think of that word culture, and it's typically ethnicity. We think of the ethnic experience. As a Native American male who grew up in a small town, yes, that was my experience. That was my ethnic experience. But pedagogy, when we talk about teaching and learning, I think is a bigger, it's a bigger concept than just that word culture. So I want to reframe a little bit when we say that word, at least the way that I use it in my work, is it's shared experience. Culture is shared experience, which goes beyond ethnicity. I've been in education for 25 years, so not quite as long as Dr. Gloria Latson-Billings. Although I did hear her speak, and one of the things that I mentioned was my goal for that swag activity. My accomplishment was actually being sharing a stage with Gloria. It's been quite an honor. So. I've been an instructional coach for 14 years, which instructional coaching is kind of a new thing in education. But it's essentially doing the work that we're gathered here today to talk about, which is how do we teach better? How do we become better practitioners of teaching and learning? I also don't like to use the word or the term Dr. Livingston for many reasons. Because you can't presume that, right? That's an old, mostly because of that, but also mostly because I don't have a doctorate, so I'm not Dr. Livingston at all. When I was invited here to talk to you all about pedagogy and inclusive teaching and how to teach inclusively. That's such a big topic. So to narrow it down to 75 minutes of information that I can share with you from my experience has been a bit of a challenge, but I think I got some good stuff for you guys. My journey in instructional coaching actually started in my own district. So the district that I attended as an elementary student was the same district that I got to work as an instructional coach in for the first time. And one of my first experiences, because I actually got my start at South High School in Minneapolis after my undergrad. And one of my first instructional coaching experiences was at first grade level. If you're in elementary education, you're going to know exactly where I'm going with this example, but it's a good one, it's juicy. I was asked to fill in for the normal teacher who was out on maternity. She had been out for 3 months, so the kids had a substitute. Let me say that again. The kids had a substitute teacher for 3 months, and they were first graders, okay? There's something about not having your normal teacher when you're 7 that really throws you off kilter. And so I went in, and I actually, as a coach, right, you're supposed to be the expert in instruction. So here's me with my manual, and I had my little manipulatives, and the goal for that lesson that day was to build these number staircases. And first graders have these little stacking blocks that they make numbers with. So the number 3 has 3 blocks, and 4, and so on and so on. So the idea was to organize single-digit numbers in an orderly fashion so they could see that as the numbers went on, they got bigger. And I thought, this is going to be amazing. This is going to, as a coach, I'm going to record this. I brought my camera to record this. And the only way I can explain what unfolded in that first grade classroom in Red Lake Elementary School 14 years ago was, if you've ever seen those nature shows on National Geographic when the hyenas take down a full-grown gazelle. What I learned that day was really the start of my journey in instructional coaching. And as an instructional coach, I've had to learn a lot about pedagogy, and I've had to learn a lot about inclusive pedagogy. When you speak from my lens, which is as I mentioned, Native American man in this country, also as a small town person, there's a lot of culture that goes with both of those things. So when I started as an undergrad, and you'll be surprised that I actually did not attend the University of Wisconsin. My squad, who I convinced about 5 of my friends to go over the border and attend the University of Minnesota. So these are 4 of my closest friends from a program called the Summer Institute, which was kind of a Head Start program before we entered our freshman year. And thinking back now on it, I'm so grateful for that experience, because it really it gave us a chance to explore the campus. It gave us a chance to meet friends and meet faculty and really become familiar with a campus that was over 52,000 students within this 10-mile radius. So you have all of these people that it's easy to get lost in a large school. And I will say that some of the cultural differences, right? So going back to the cultural differences, there are gender differences, right? If you have a significant other or spouse, you know those differences. In fact, one of the exercises that I do is we talk about pet peeves with your significant other. And as soon as I say pet peeve, what's really interesting when you work with a group of teachers is the women have about 15 pet peeves right off the top of their heads, and the men sit very quietly and reserved in the back. So they're the gender differences when we talk about culture, that shared experience. Small town culture. When you talk about Wisconsin culture, that's very different from Minnesota culture. And what I can tell you is that the beer and cheese in Minnesota is not to standard. It's not to Wisconsin standards, right? They claim to be a dairy state over there, but they are not. Also, wearing camo and blaze orange to formal events is frowned upon in Minnesota. So It's, yeah. They also don't know when you say keep her moving, that's a Wisconsin thing. Hey there, guy, Wisconsin thing. One of the activities at the University of Minnesota that I thought and felt as an undergrad was really powerful was has to do with this bridge. If you've ever been to Minnesota, this is the specifically the Twin Cities. This is the Washington Bridge. It connects the two banks on the University of Minnesota campus, West Bank, East Bank. There's an event at the beginning of each school year. It's the kickoff event. It's the Paint the Bridge event. And any person, any student, if you're enrolled at the University of Minnesota and you're in an organization, you can go and paint one section of this bridge. Again, thinking back on this, so this was many, many years ago, how important and powerful that experience was sort of escaped me at the time, but looking back on it now and thinking about the many different cultures that came together, the many different shared experiences. And again, I don't mean ethnic culture, even though there was an assortment of ethnic cultures there, but it was different organizations. It was human rights organizations. It was our American Indian Student Association organization. It was the College Republican organization. It was all of these student groups that got together this day, and I think really made it a successful event because it brought all of these shared experiences together. So when I think about cultural pedagogy, for me, the purpose of cultural pedagogy and the intent is to really bridge those cultural differences. So when we talk about culture, there's explicit and then there's implicit culture. And if you've studied the cultural iceberg, right? The top, the explicit culture is the stuff that you can see, the stuff that is visible. The implicit culture is the stuff you don't see. So if I make a statement like, I really enjoy and love Star Trek, you can start to make assumptions about my implicit culture. Incidentally, when you say, and Gloria, I'm sure you have this experience, I actually do not, when I travel, and I travel quite a bit, when I'm on a plane and somebody asks me what I do, I generally don't say I'm a math teacher anymore. Because there's a certain response that you get when you say you're a math teacher. So I avoid it altogether because then it's usually followed up, well, what's your name? What's your first name? Oh, wait, your name's RunningHorse and you're a math teacher? Like, that's crazy. And I'm not a chatty person on a plane, so I don't, I'll be cordial and I'll be nice and I'll say hey, good to meet you, neighbor. But beyond that, it's a fairly uneventful ride. When I think about as I said, the impact of this bridge experience at the University of Minnesota, it also reminds me of my favorite class experiences during my undergrad. As an architectural engineering student, my favorite classes, there were two of them. It was Greek and Roman mythology and historic movies. Those are my two. I shouldn't say that because I know that my instructors, who were my architectural engineering instructors, would not be pleased about that. But I think what I learned from those courses, and I think why it's relevant here today, is because I didn't learn, while I learned a lot about Greek and Roman mythology and movies, historical movies, this was the thing that I learned the most from those two classes. I thought that I was a good writer, but until those two courses figured out that I was not a good writer. And I learned a skill that I carried with me throughout my undergrad, but also into my adult life and my professional career. Writing it's an important skill that you take with you for the rest of your life. So something that I learned in these two courses that had nothing to do with my major actually taught me something that I've taken with me into my personal and professional career. And what I've learned from that experience is that teaching and learning it's messy. It's not a precise science. It's sort of an art and a science. And if you can kind of wrap your head around the science part of it, but also the art part of it, so what decisions do I make when I'm in front of a class to bring in, as Gloria mentioned, when you teach at the post-secondary level, and I thought this was a perfect statement about what we do. as a methods teacher, I can't teach my students to be teachers. I can give them the information, and then I have to rely on them when they go to do the work to become those practitioners. And so we try to teach teaching as a process, not as a career. So we don't teach teaching, we teach students. And so I think that's been the guiding light for me through my coaching career. Also, as a coach, I've traveled to the four corners of our wonderful country. And what I can tell you after traveling, I think I've traveled to about 90% of our states. I've worked with students and teachers in about 90% of our states. What I can tell you is that the challenges that we face in teaching and learning, regardless of what level you're at, are the same. The challenges we have in the state of Wisconsin, the things that we've talked about here, are challenges that we are experiencing in Alaska, in California, in Florida. They're everywhere. Kids are pretty similar. Students are pretty similar, right? It's just as likely for a student from Anchorage to go to college as it is a student from Bayfield, Wisconsin. Students from Sacramento, California are just as likely to choose STEM careers as kids from Madison, Wisconsin. It's all the same, and the challenges are the same. So I want to give an example before we get into we are going to do an activity, and we can distribute those when you're ready. I want to give you an example from my work, what we do. As Gloria mentioned, one of the hardest content areas to reach people and impact that shift in thinking about effective practice and inclusive teaching, that inclusive mindset, is mathematics. And as a mathematics teacher, getting other people to realize and see the importance of that, of what we do, not just what we teach, but what we do, I think is critical. In 2012, there was a study that Michigan State put out. And Michigan State, and this was Dr. Schmidt in 2012, that wanted to compare the Common Core standards. So Common Core standards were the new global standards. They sort of shifted everything in education, and people in education PK-12 freaked out because they were very different from what we were used to. And this graph was very telling and informed a lot of my work and my research in education. And I think it informs us as a system rather than just individual buildings and particular grade levels or particular education levels. So what this graph says is at the top, when they did the research, they looked at the states and they compared the rigor of the standards for learning that were being proposed and accepted by all of these states. So every state before that had their own set of standards that said, okay, in mathematics, kids need to know this at third grade. In reading, they need to know this. So there was a set of standards. When they did the comparison of state standards compared to the rigor of Common Core standards, the top states were 1 year behind in terms of rigor. The bottom states were two to 2.5 years behind the level of rigor in Common Core. So what does that mean as an educator? That means in the state of Wisconsin, when we had the WKCE, which was the old way of measuring knowledge, if you had a third grader pass the WKCE in 2010, that actually meant they were performing at a first grade level compared to Common Core standards. So what does that mean for post-secondary? It means that all of those gaps that we know students leave our buildings with are doing this thing. They're growing. And you can see that when you look at state data now on the tests. We're not doing so well. So here's one of the things that we look at. And I'm gonna do an experiment with you. This is one of the things that we as teachers to really think about our own pedagogy. This is an example. So I'm going to write an expression on the board up here. And what I'd like you to do is I want you to just think about a context that would go with this expression. In other words, a story problem. So in your brain, I want you to come up with a story problem that goes with this particular expression. Are we ready? And you don't have to write it down. I just want you to think about it. 7 to 8 seconds, is that the right time, Gloria? So the expression is 6 divided by 1/2. I want you to think about a story problem or a context that would go with that particular expression. Now, let's think about this first. Let's do the computation. So we know the answer is obviously 3, right? So if we think about the story problem, does anybody have one they want to share? Do we have the mic? Kristen?
Yep, I got the mic.
Anybody have a good one they want to share? Yeah?
Oh, sure. Someone
Yeah,
in the
he's
very
way,
back.
he's
Thank
way
you.
back there.
My after lunch run.
So I want you to listen to the story problem that's being given and see if it fits with our expression up here, okay?
Well, I have 6 apples and I'd like to give 12 kids something to eat. So it'll be 6 divided by halves, which is multiplying by the reciprocal, give you 12.
All right. So 6 apples and you have 12 kids. So if I were to write your expression, this would be my expression. It's pretty close, right? And that's actually a really good example. Nice job. When I do this particular process with teachers, we usually get like if I have 6 apples, I'm going to share those between 2 children, which is actually 6 divided by 2, right? Oh, okay. No, let me try over. If I have 6 apples and I eat half of them, that also is not 6 divided by 1/2. That is 6 times 1/2. So there was a study that compared Chinese pedagogy to American pedagogy. So what is it about the way that we teach mathematics in our country? To me, it points to the very reason that we're gathered here today to talk about inclusive pedagogy. When you think about why, when we think about 6 divided by 1/2, because when I said the quotient was 3, half of you didn't even blink. You were like, sounds good to me. 6 divided by half is 3. Looks good, right? Because we see 6 and we see half. And then coming up with a situation, right, is the next level of this. In the study, when they compared China to our country, what they found, and now I have to give you a little bit of the information on this particular study. We sent our best and brightest, our master teachers they were called. So we sent a group over there and said, hey, go do this study and see what you guys find out, see if there's any difference between what they're doing in China, because if you're not aware, in terms of mathematics across the planet, the United States, we do not do so well in mathematics. China is always one of the top 5. So Lai-Ping Ma, who was the researcher, wanted to know what's the difference in the way that we teach this particular content. So when they looked at this particular item, they actually gave this to teachers, to both of the control groups. They gave it to the Chinese teachers, they gave it to the American teachers. One caveat, the Chinese teachers didn't get the memo about you have to send master teachers. So they sent a random sample of teachers, rookies, veterans, all kinds of teachers. So they almost threw out the data. But the data was so compelling. When China did this problem, and there were 2 parts to this problem. Part 1, solve this problem. Just compute it. Part 2, come up with a story problem or a context that would help students explore this expression. When the Chinese teachers computed this, did the mathematics for this, which is our rule, right? Multiply by the reciprocal. 100% of the Chinese teachers, no problem. The answer is 12. Only 47% of our teachers were able to successfully solve that computation problem, right? Okay, but wait, there's part two, right? There's still another part. We can come back. On the coming up with a specific example for the story problem, only 94% of the Chinese teachers were able to come up with an appropriate expression, which is still pretty good, right? How do you think we did? Think better or worse than the computation? You'd hope better, right? 0%. 0% of our teachers were able to come up with an appropriate context for this particular expression. So what does that say, and why is that important to the work that we do? In human psychology, we teach when we're not sure how to teach something, we teach it the way that we were taught to teach it. And so when we talk about inclusivity, being aware, being culturally competent, what we're actually asking is you to step outside of your own cultural comfort zone to reach people that don't have that shared experience. And that is the challenge. It's not so much that you don't buy into this. We can all buy into this. We can all say, hey, we want to be better practitioners. We want to be better instructors. We do. But as Gloria mentioned, it's hard to know the how. The how-to is the difficult part. When I think about the pedagogy that exists in our country today, rather than me explain it, you can watch a TED Talk. If some of you have probably watched this one already, Sir Ken Robinson talks about industrial pedagogy and its impacts on our education system. And to me, because I go to schools all over the country, I still see the aftermath of industrial pedagogy. And as college instructors, as people who educate the people that leave our secondary systems, you see the impacts of this as well. So, when I think about this question, cultural pedagogy, how do we include more people in the way that we teach in our classrooms? And I think about the difference when you have cultural clashes with people. When does that happen, and what results of that clash? One of the instances, and I can think of a movie, it's one of my favorite movies, Remember the Titans? Right? It's a football movie. It's got, the lead actor is Denzel, thank you, Gloria. Denzel Washington. And there's a scene, it's a very culturally energized scene. The whole movie is, of course, because it talks about the desegregation in our schools. But there's a particular scene where Bertier, who is the main linebacker, he's the All-American, he's the white kid, right? And they're all in the locker room, and he starts making a joke. One of his colleagues on a team, who is a African-American gentleman, makes a joke about Bertier's mama, right? Because me and Bertier's mama were out on the town last night. And if you recall the movie, Bertier gets really offended and almost starts to fight the guy, right? Because he's offended by him saying something about his mama. But it was really it was an olive branch to cross that cultural experience. And it was very powerful for me because as a Native American male, in Native culture, we use humor all the time. It's a way of relating to people. It's a way of going past shared experiences that differ from mine to relate to people. And so I was like, wait, why is he freaking out? Right? So I watched that scene and I'm like, I find myself on this side of the fence because my own bias allows me to view that scene that particular way. But not all people watch that scene the same way. So we're going to try something within our groups, and we're actually going to, there are folders on the tables. And for our other campuses, we're going to give you a few minutes to do this. So if you haven't distributed the folders at the other campuses, make sure you get the folders distributed. I'll give you a few minutes to do that as I kind of explain what we are going to do. Now, The other campuses will be participating in this as well. So we will be doing an activity for about 20 minutes. The next 20 minutes, we'll be doing an activity. Do not touch the folders yet. Just like my students. See, this is why we say, regardless of what level you teach. Okay, so let me explain a little bit about the folders. Every table at this site will have a folder, okay? Now, the end result of the activity is a product. You're actually going to be building a traditional wigwam, a traditional structure, so it's kind of a spherical structure. All the tools and instructions are in the envelope, so don't worry. If you've never built, I don't have the experience, it's fine. All the instructions, everything are in the envelopes. You will have, when I say go, you will have exactly 5 minutes at your tables to get as far as you can building this structure. And then we will talk about the experience after that and how far we got. Now, I will say after and this goes for the other campuses as well, when your groups are finished building, you're going to display your final product up here on the stage. So when I give you the cue, I want you to select a group member to bring your structure up to the front so that we can all kind of compare our structures. Okay, so I hope we're ready on the other campuses. We'll give you an extra 30 seconds to distribute over there, and we are going to come back at, it is 1:33 now. We're going to come back at 1:53, other campuses. And for us, we are going to work for the next 5 minutes on our structures. Ready, set, go. Some interesting feedback that we've heard from some of the groups. Anybody want to volunteer their table's discussion? Oh, we need the mics.
Okay, sorry. I got distracted.
Right here at the second table.
One of our table mates brought up the idea of online learning and how, as instructors, a lot of times we talk about it's my academic freedom. I know how to create my class in any way that I want to create it. But I know at our college, the biggest complaint that we have from students is every instructor's Blackboard shell, and we use Blackboard as our LMS, is different. And it takes me forever, if I even can find the instructions and how they write those instructions. And so course design is huge in online learning, and it will shape course delivery. Mm-hmm. So, but until we nail down that course design, and we have to realize as instructors that that learning experience that we design online is so key to them being successful in the online classroom. It's not about the students, it's about us and how we design that learning experience. And until we come together and wrap our heads around that, because online learning is not going away.
Nope.
It's just going to get bigger. So that was Madeline's actually. I was going to speak for her, but that was a really great analogy to this.
Great.
Looking at online
Yeah,
learning.
it's an excellent point. And one of my classes is online. We use Blackboard, I think, is our and the same thing. Like I get comments all the time from my students about the way that we use it and where the content is. Well, you should put the assignments in the content, not in the assignments or the assessment. Like it's crazy. Back there.
Right, so an overall thought pattern around the table. I'm going to try and summarize it this way. You can tell me if I'm not doing it well, so go for it. Based on how we receive our education, we've reached the point where doing things within a certain time constraint will decide whether or not we're intelligent or not. The moment you said time constraint, everybody went with the ideas, well, I've got to be intelligent to show that I can actually do this within that time. Clearly, we can all read, we all have a vocab, but because there was a time constraint, we missed comprehending the thing in totality sometimes. Some of the details got messed up and missing, and then suddenly we realized we had pencils that were short, we realized information was short, we also realized that some of the rulers were calibrated in a weird way. So that all played into either managing to be successful at the end or just giving up. So a lot of little pieces came in there. So comprehension is vital in terms of understanding. So we might have to redefine how we measure intelligence, because clearly based on this little activity, we might need more time to appreciate the detail in order to get to where we want to be.
Yeah, and I appreciate the time comment, because I think one of the things that falls out from this activity is how much pressure there is due to the time constraint, but also I think there's a level of performance that comes with education, that comes with teaching and learning. So when and Gloria talked about this, when you have the hand raisers in your class, and being intentional about how you have discussions in your classroom. And I was so glad she made that comment, because that's one of the things that I work with teachers on quite a bit, is discourse in the classroom. So when you're having discourse in your classroom, how are you allowing that to happen? How are you getting students who are sitting way in the back, who are intentionally disengaging, to participate in your conversation? Because what I can tell you is conversation is one of those things that is an effective practice in all pedagogy. If students aren't talking about what they're learning, then they're not processing and they're just performing. And when you're performing academia, it's a lot like karaoke. I make that analogy all the time. If you think about karaoke, right? How many of you are excellent karaoke singers? One of you, yes, one of you. It's sort of like that. If somebody were to ask you to go in karaoke, right? If we set up a machine right here, there wouldn't be a line waiting for the machine for all of us to sing, right? You'd have to be kind of pushed up there and prodded to get up there, because it's a performance, and education sometimes feels like that to our students. So how do we create that learning environment in our classrooms that Gloria gave excellent examples of, the accountability piece, right? How do you get kids to, so the cadaver example, when students are responsible for their group's learning, there's accountability to the community, to the learning community. And it's not just 4 kids sitting in a proximity group, right? So group work, cooperative grouping is an important part of teaching and learning. Did we have other comments? Yes.
So we were looking for the rubric and how would we be judged and if we would be judged, because one of our persons wanted to be very literal and like make it exactly the way the picture, because we had a picture. And another person wanted to be a little more creative and improve the design. And then also, I didn't discuss this with my group, but when you said bring it up, I'm like, oh, now the judging's actually going to happen. Like we're actually going to be competing. So some people like to be competitive. And
even though that was not an element, even though I didn't say we're going to be judging your final product, that sense was sort of built into it. Like, oh, it's going to be up there, like where everybody can see it, which again goes back to that performance thing. But also how do we do, I mean, there's sort of this instilled measuring, like Rubrics are big right now because it gives us a better idea of measuring the stuff that we're teaching in our classrooms. So that's a great point. One more comment and then we need to.
Thank you. Personally, actually, what I thought was interesting, I felt somewhat uncomfortable initially, but being shameless about going and looking to see what other folks were doing, and also being shameless about begging for things that I needed. So the sense of creating community and reaching out and asking for what resources were needed.
Yes. Yeah, one of the interesting things about this task is most times, and you guys did an excellent job of doing that. I saw one of the people walking around to each table saying, how did you do this or how did you do that? Which is very resourceful. We like students that do that. But most of the time, we don't share. When I do this activity with teachers, there's not a lot of sharing. There's not a lot of teachers going to other tables and saying, well, you know, can we have some of your materials, which was done very intentionally. And what's interesting is in some groups, I've had groups where the group that had more than enough materials actually made fun of the group's products that didn't have enough. And there was this like debate that sort of happened. I was like, whoa, whoa, like, you know, having to get that under. But it was. I think what it spoke to me about was teaching and learning, especially the learning side of education. It's very much tied to your self-efficacy, because what you know is a direct reflection of who you are as a person. And so when you're doing academia in your classroom, if we continue to do it in a way that's, if you're not doing it correctly, and Gloria's statement was great, that it's not that they're learning, they're learning what we want them to learn, as opposed to learning the way that they prefer to learn as individuals. And it's hard to do that as an instructor. Some of the common feedback from the build activity, for groups that did not have enough materials, I felt like we worked harder because we didn't have enough stuff. We had to be more creative. We had to do a lot more problem solving. So we actually did a lot more work than the other groups did because we didn't have enough materials. That's a very interesting concept, because when you think about students coming to the classroom, they bring many different levels of experience. And a student who might feel like they're doing a lot of work to do what you want them to learn might be different from a student who's more proficient in what you're trying to teach. It's and we don't think about that, right? We just see the final product. We just look at this part and we say, we're going to grade this part, regardless of the effort. And it is hard to grade effort. How do you grade effort? If that's one of the 4 C's for 21st century skills, how do we grade effort? How do we know that we should be focusing on the journey and not the destination, but how do we grade that? That's a complex idea. I didn't think about other groups not having the appropriate items. So at your own table, we sort of silo ourselves, right? This is our work, we're going to do this, and you hadn't even considered what was going on at other tables. That happens all the time in classrooms. Students do that all the time with each other. There was zero sharing, so this one comes up quite a bit. Well, we just didn't think to share with other groups. Why does that happen in this activity, and what does that speak to about the classroom experience of students? And finally, I was a little embarrassed about the product we were putting out there. So showing it up here, when it's on display, does that impact your, as the gentleman back here stated, it's a reflection of your intelligence. So if I don't have a good final product, it means something about my ability to learn and my level of intelligence. And what I can tell you at the K-12 level, that happens all the time. And teachers who are unaware of the social and emotional impacts of learning find that difficult to get past, right? It goes back to what Gloria said about teaching content rather than teaching students. If you're teaching content, you tend to be unaware of the social and emotional issues unfolding in your classroom. All right. So one of the recent studies that I found very compelling came from the Teachers College record in 2017. And what I want you to do when you read this statement is I want you to replace the word schools with colleges and the word children with students. What I can tell you about the experience at the PK-12 level and the way that I think it's relevant, the work that I do with adult learners as a coach, what you're doing when you're teaching, teaching is a very private thing because it's who you are as individuals as much as it is your job. So asking somebody to do it in a way that may be more impactful for students in your room with different shared experiences can be a challenge. one of the teachers that I wanted to highlight, his name was Al. He was a secondary teacher in Minnesota. And Al had been to my workshops, and my workshops are no joke. I used to do 5-day summer workshops for teachers just on math, right? So we can imagine going and sitting through 5 days, full days of math training. That's what I used to do years ago. Al had come to 4 years of that training, and he loved it. I mean, every time we would do an activity, we did this activity, we did a lot of hands-on stuff, we wrote problems, we solved problems. It was very enjoyable, I think, for most teachers, including Al. But whenever I went to Al's classroom, I wouldn't see any of the stuff that we talked about, or any of the things that he concluded were effective practice. And I would see Al every month. So I would do this summer training, and then I would follow up once a month, and I would go to his school, and I would go into his classroom. And Al was pretty traditional in terms of, so in math we say traditional or reform-based teachers. He was a very traditional math teacher. He probably reminded of your own teacher, which was, hey, I want you to turn to page 236. We're going to do examples 1 through 4, and then you're going to do problems 1 through 33, odd. And then if you have time or you want extra credit, you can do problems 34 and 35, which were generally story problems. It wasn't until Al, when I came into his room, and this was in a December class, so I was there, we did the rigmarole. He was like, hey, come on in. This is my Algebra 2 class. We're working on this. And he had an idea that day, and he said, hey, I have a thought. We're working on two-step equations. I want to see how you would do this lesson. And so it was me being called to the carpet now to display. So I've been talking about this for 4 summers now. I've been talking about effective practice. Now I had to put this into play in an Algebra 2 classroom. And so I had about 10 minutes to get ready for this next class. And so I wrote out kind of a script, not a lesson plan, but just a script. Here's how I think the conversation is going to go based on the questions that I'm asking. And it actually went exactly that way, and the kids were engaged. I told a story about a friend of mine from England who had a very thick English accent, and he would always give the temperature in Celsius, because over there they use Celsius, they don't use Fahrenheit. So we talked about the conversion from Fahrenheit to Celsius. And then of course they were like, well, is that like a real story? Like, who is this guy? Like, can we look him up? Like, what is this? And so right away they were engaged because of the context of the problem. And when I finished that lesson, after I talked with Al, he said, so that's what you've been asking us to do? I was like, bro, yeah, that's what I've been saying, man. I don't know where I miscommunicated. And that same year, and this was in January, so after the holiday break, I came back in January. This classroom was night and day. This man, who had been, he was a teacher for 30 years at that point. He had 30 years experience teaching secondary mathematics. The kids, who all had called him Mr. H, because Habitank apparently is a hard word to say, were now calling him Spidey. Hey, Spidey! It was his nickname in college. I didn't ask. The problems that he was giving were no longer from the book. All of his textbooks were on the shelf. And on top of his shelves, he had all these dolls and artifacts from, he and his wife were geocachers. I'd never heard of geocaching until I met Al. And they would go worldwide. They traveled the world to go geocaching. If you don't know what geocaching is, it's like adult scavenger hunting, that's what I compare it to. And so all of his problems typically had some relevance to this he would talk about a geocaching adventure. And the kids loved it. His scores, I think, jumped about 20% in his classes that year from those small changes that he made. And so when I think about inclusive practice, the inclusive practice that became evident in his classroom wasn't because of some new textbook. It wasn't because of some big new initiative in his district. It wasn't because the state of Minnesota rewrote the state standards. It was because he got a license to be creative. And he saw an example of what the kind of change that we were looking for. Now, that doesn't happen all the time. That's a pretty unique situation. But I think it's a perfect example of teaching students and not content. When I think about the goal, I'm constantly reminded of how far we are from that goal. This picture was taken 2 weeks ago. And when I watch these classrooms, it's hard not to get a little emotional. It's hard not to get a little agitated because it's 2019. We've been saying this stuff, and I think one of the, as a educator / researcher, one of the things that has challenged us at the research level is really tying research to practice. We know that there's a discrepancy between the research that we put out and what we actually do in our classrooms. But it's given me hope that Gloria and myself can now say the same thing because all of the research is starting to finally consolidate on this idea of inclusive pedagogy. And in order to move forward in our organizations, we have to start doing this stuff because when we don't, this is what happens. This is the picture of what happens. And high schoolers are very different. They posture very differently than college students. Not all the time, but college kids do this, but maybe not outwardly. High school kids are not ashamed to show you that they're disengaged in your classroom. So, the research part of this. What guides my work are the 4 C's, as I mentioned. I think the 4 C's are very appropriate for all levels of education. And if you're not familiar with the 4 C's, they're critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and communication. And when I think of the examples that Gloria gave to us, each one of those successful classrooms demonstrated one of the 4 C's, at least one of the 4 C's. The Dr. M, the rapping guy, right? The professor. He gave kids a way of communicating what their knowledge was. That's a way of communication. Communication is huge when it comes to teaching and learning. So one of the studies that came out of the Chronicle Higher Education talked about college students, those who struggle, and what are their needs. And I think these are, I actually show these to high school teachers because they're not all that different from college kids' experience. So number 1, feel our pain. That's what struggling students want us to know. And what that speaks to me, is empathy. We, at the PK-12 level, we talk a lot about mindfulness. We talk a lot about growth mindset. So how do we create empathy? Students tend to do better when they know that you can sense their experience or that there's some sensitivity to what they're experiencing as students. Now, we've talked about that being difficult because if you have a different shared experience, how do you relate to somebody that doesn't have your same culture, if we say that word? Help us out of the mess we're in. Now, I know when we read that, I read this as a parent. Sometimes I read that as a parent. I'm like, well, if you get yourself in a mess, right? We teach our children to help themselves get out of the mess that they create. But I think what this speaks to is problem solving. So how do, as Gloria mentioned in communication, sometimes college kids don't know how to communicate in the classroom the way that you're expecting them to. So you have to model that because 19-year-olds, and I can tell you this from experience, are really not all that different from 7-year-olds. And I can say that with absolute certainty because whenever I do a first grade lesson, I use the same kind of pedagogy as when I go to the next classroom and I do a systems of equations lesson with 17-year-olds. It's the same pedagogy. So I know that this is these issues that struggling students experience are very relevant. And they came out in this study, and I know why. I can see why the experience of students these days, they bring out these challenges. Don't hate us when we fail. In mathematics especially, we're very afraid of teaching mistakes or addressing mistakes. We want to teach math the right way because that's the way math was taught to us. And yet, when students make mistakes, which they do all the time in mathematics, we don't consider them moments of learning, teaching opportunities, and they are. Sometimes we learn more from doing something incorrectly than we do from doing it correctly over and over and over again. So how do we embrace that? And then finally, give us multiple varied chances to succeed. When I think about the lessons that we give in our classrooms, for me, I try to think of the experience. So in my methods classes, I could lecture all day about how to teach, but unless they experience that, right? Every single PK-12 teacher has a story about their first day on the job. If you know somebody that's a high school teacher, middle school teacher, ask them about their first day, and I guarantee you'll hear a long story, and it'll be an entertaining story. And my favorite quote, and I'll leave you with an image that's one of my favorites, but also these words. I think in education now, it really doesn't look all that different than it did 50 years ago, unfortunately. And yet the needs are changing. We tend to be, in our country, a nation of convenient problem solvers. And yet we need people in our economy that we can't even predict yet, that are problem solvers, because that's the skill that they will take with them beyond the math class and beyond the typical classroom. And so when I think about how we do that, the 4 C's, how do we incorporate the 4 C's? Critical thinking, creativity, collaboration, and communication. It's a challenge. It's not an easy thing. But when I think about the classes that I loved as an undergrad, Greek and Roman mythology, I learned how to write. I learned a life skill from those classes that really had nothing to do with my major. And if we can do it with that, I know that we can teach the 4 C's in whatever content we teach. It doesn't have to be a specific content to explore the 4 C's, which are our 21st century skills. And so the responsibility we have as teachers is not just the academic experience, but also the social and emotional journeys that accompany that academic experience. You're not just teaching context, you're teaching people. And the people who need the learning experiences, as Gloria mentioned, to become more productive citizens so that we can have a more productive economy. So thank you for your efforts. I know that your efforts as educators sometimes go unrecognized, but here with your peers, I want you to know that they are not. So thank you all for your efforts, and thank you for your time today, and on Wisconsin.
Do you want to take a couple questions? Okay. Running Horse said there's time to take a few questions. So if you have a question, I'm ready to run again. Couple questions. Come on, somebody has a question.
Oh.
Oh, great.
So my question is, how do you take these pedagogies that require some individualization and, in my experience, extra time, and scale them up? So if you have a class of 50 or 60 and you have 4 of those a semester, how do you scale that up from a class where you have 15 or 20 individuals? As far as a time management type of
Sure.
strategy? I don't know if you have any.
Yeah,
advice.
no, I think size, I actually don't worry as much about size, and I have classrooms that are well over 30, not the 50 and 60, but I think the The demands of teaching still remain the same. So just because you have a larger class, it doesn't negate the needs that those students have in that room to talk about what they're learning, to explore what they're learning. We were nervous about this activity, in fact, because when we did the build activity, I remember the meeting that we had with Kristen, and I pitched the idea, well, hey, we should do this build activity. And they were like, you know that we're going to have like 600 people, right? And so there was some nervousness about doing this with a large group. And one of the folks that helped plan this talked about that. So how do we, your exact question, how do we impact and reach the people who may not be able to participate in this, which is why we talked about the fishbowl kind of activity. I don't know that all students need to experience it at the same level, because as learners, they have many different ways to take in information. So I don't worry about quite as much about the size as I do about just the basic pedagogy. If that makes sense.
Question? Okay.
Do you have any recommendations on rewarding sharing? So you've talked about sharing in the classroom, and is there a way, much like talking about evaluating effort, do you have any recommendations about rewarding sharing?
Yeah, so rewarding sharing, and I think that's a big one, because we talk about at the PK-12 level, it's positive reinforcement. So how do you reinforce the behaviors and the actions that you want your students to perform? I think it comes down to that social piece. And this is what I've learned as a coach. There's something in mathematics called perseverance. Other people call it grit. So when we talk about students sort of sticking with a problem or sticking with a task that we've given, how do we help them become more perseverant in tackling those kinds of tasks and problems? And it's actually written into the standards. So how do you build perseverance? You can't just go to a class and say, hey, you guys need to persevere more, so I don't know what to tell you. It's sort of the same question. So how do you get communication that is effective, right, in your classroom? How do you relate? There is no one way, because everybody has a way of communicating that's different from other people. So what I would say is I worry more about the accountability piece. So how do I make students accountable to the group rather than just for themselves? So if we're doing a task like this, I might have, and if I know that there are struggling students in my classroom, when I have them do group activities, I assign them certain, not roles, I don't do the role thing, but I do random things that they think are random. So I might say, okay, there's a group of 4 here. Every group of 4, you're going to choose a letter, M, A, T, or H. And once they're done doing the task or the activity that I've had them work on, if I see that some of my strugglers are disengaging from that process, because that happens all the time in group work, one student does the work, I will look around and I will say, I know the A's are some of my struggling students. So at the beginning, I will say, the A's are going to explain the work that your group has done. And what happens to the A's is they scramble. They get nervous because for whatever reason, that random assignment, like my letter got called, I need to explain my group's work, has some kind of impact. So we call it randomosity. We use randomosity in our math classrooms because it's like the teachers have the magical sticks of destiny also, right? The little wooden sticks with their names on them. Oh, look, I picked Justin. Justin has to explain. And they like, oh my gosh, I have to explain, right? It's different than calling on somebody and saying, I want you to answer. I want you to demonstrate your academic performance in front of the class.
One more. It was just a statement. Oh, okay. Go read it because I asked.
Okay. Is the skill that Al mastered or realized simply storytelling a true story from his own life?
Is that?
That came in from the other side.
So yeah, so Al's story. So part of it was the stories, but he didn't have to learn the stories. He just needed the permission to use those stories. And this is, as a researcher, one of the things that I've looked at a lot and studied a lot is pedagogy of native indigenous pedagogy. So what does that mean? Native people tend to be storytellers. If you've ever gone to a storytelling event, they have them all the time at UW. I think they have them here at Madison College because that's an important part of the Native experience is storytelling. Well, when you tell teachers that, well, Native American storytelling is, it's a culturally appropriate, that demonstrates cultural competence. But as a math teacher, if I teach Algebra 2, how does bringing in a storyteller to tell stories help my students learn Algebra 2 more or better, right? So the part that's missing and the part that I've spent the last 14 years working on is what is it about storytelling that makes it an effective practice? What makes it an effective practice is you take information and you put it in a context, you put it in a vehicle, and then you transfer it to somebody and you say, hey, consider all of this stuff and learn this about what we're analyzing. It's different than saying, here's the information, now learn it and remember it. That's a different process. So the process of storytelling is very different than the act of storytelling. And I make one of my favorite sayings is we teach culturally, and that's different from teaching culture. There's a very big distinction between teaching culture and teaching culturally. And as a Native person, an indigenous background, that's very true. I try to distinguish what I do from teaching culture because everybody has a different culture. Even with my own tribe, you can have the same tribe, but families can be very different from tribe to tribe. So the culture, even within a culture group, is different. And to me, teaching culturally is more important sometimes than the act of teaching culture. So, did I get to or is that a roundabout answer?
Like I said, I think it was an observation as well as a...
Yeah. And Al was, like I said, Al had the stories. He just needed the permission to use the stories to teach his students. He needed the idea that I can use my own experience to teach about these really abstract math concepts. I really didn't do anything in terms of the content, but just sort of allowing him to be more of himself, who he was socially, rather than the academic Mr. Habedank.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
We're going to take a quick break, but before we do that, and I want to make sure that folks know how we're going to round out the end of our day. We're about an hour and 5-10 minutes from the end of our day. So I encourage you to stay. We have a faculty panel that will be sharing their equitable practices. They've prepared very short remarks, but definitely want to engage with the audience regarding those things that you're doing as well. So that's a really important give and take at each of our sites locally. And then I am going to put a teaser out that if you stay till the end, you will, at the wrap up, be able to then understand and discuss the work beyond today. And that includes sub-grant opportunities for you faculty. So thank you. Yes, we'll reconvene at 2:35, right back. And again, we're going to wrap up and be diligent of your time. So we'll finish right up at 3:30. Thank you.